Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Steve Goldman. I'm the director of the Center for Free Enterprise, and I want to welcome you to our second event of the Menard Family Lecture Series. And this event is jointly sponsored with Truist, and it's the Truist Annual Lecture on Free Enterprise, and also the Young America's Foundation, YAF. And so we want to thank all of our sponsors for their help. As a Truist Distinguished Professor of Free Enterprise, I definitely want to thank Truist for all their support and remind students they should consider taking my Econ 375 class, Capitalism and Economic Freedom. If you like these ideas, you'll like that class. If you don't like these ideas, you'll get tools to figure out how to argue against them. So YAF has sent some materials you may be interested in. They can be found on the table outside the door. And so pick up anything you would like from that. Our last event is going to be on Tuesday, March 25th. Jane Grody Abel from Donato's Pizza is going to talk about her company and how you make profits in an honorable way. Finally, if you're here for extra credit or the reading group, scan the survey, make sure you fill out all the information and give us your name and what you're here for and so forth so you can get your credit. So, good businesses improve the lives of others. This should be your goal in life, is to make people better off. The more value you add to the lives of others, the higher your profits will be. This is a measure of how nice you've treated other people. And so businesses do good things. So profits are a good indication of how well you're serving your fellow man, as long as you're making your profits in an honorable way. And there's ways to make them not honorably. Don't go down that path. But today's lecture is actually going to talk about those kind of ideas. And so Dr. Burt Folsom, native of Lincoln, Nebraska, IU graduate just like me, go Hoosiers, but actually go U of L. He's been a college professor at many places, including Hillsdale College in Michigan, where he still serves as a distinguished fellow. He's an economic historian, author of 10 books, including The Myth of Robber Barons, which our reading group read this semester, and it's published by the Young America's Foundation, and soon will be in the 9th edition, so it's been around for a while. He's also written Uncle Sam Can't Count, FDR Goes to War, and other books. The New Deal, or Raw Deal, is one of them, by the way, and describes Roosevelt's disastrous New Deal program. Contrary to what you might have learned in your history classes, it's not always quite the case that it might not always be true. Roosevelt's stuff kept us in the Great Depression longer than we should have been. Anyhow, I'm going to let Dr. Folsom talk because he knows way more about it than I do. So, Burt, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Steve, and thanks to Truist and to the Center for Free Enterprise and Young America's Foundation, of all fine institutions. Good to be here with you today, and good to be talking about entrepreneurs. How many here aspire to be an entrepreneur? A few? I see some hands. I see some. It's tentative. You know, when it's tentative, you're thinking about entrepreneurship, but maybe not totally buy in. Maybe more so after we talk about some, because this lecture is going to be talking about entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs 150 years ago and today. We have a little bit of a comparison as we go on. And what I want to do is, get you to think, to begin with, you hear the slogan, "Make America Great Again." The question I remember 10 years ago we never heard that, but then the first time I heard it I thought, if you're going to say "Make America Great Again," the interesting question is, it implies there's been a decline somewhere, and then we need to go back up. When was America great the last time? And some people say, well, the constitutional era and our Revolutionary War, which has some truth to that, I think. Of course, we have slavery there, and that's not good. And, you get slavery out of the way at the end of the Civil War in 1865. And that's where I want to focus. That generation after 1865, from, say, 1865 to 1905, 40-year period, had incredible burst of accomplishment which put the United States from being a second-rate power underneath England, Germany, France, the European powers way underneath, to vaulting to be not only higher than all of them, but probably higher than those three put together, at least in many indicators of economics. What happened? You know, that's a good question. You start out, what happened that America was mediocre? We went through a divisive civil war, and all of a sudden in the next generation, we rise to the top. We had a lot of freedom. You can't do it without freedom, indispensable. But then we have people making use of that freedom in an incredible way. I would argue, and I'm open to argument if some of you afterwards have a case, I want to hear it. This generation, from 1865 to 1905, was the greatest period of entrepreneurship in the history of the world. And it's all over here in America. Now, there was some elsewhere, but I'm talking about the ones I'm going to be talking about today, all in the United States. It took me a while to reach that conclusion because I kept saying, is it really greater than this? Can it really be greater than this? You know, and I kept having to say, can item after item after item, and I finally concluded, yes. It's even greater than the current generation, which has an enormous amount of contributions to world history and American history in particular. Now let me make my case. Let me start out with some of the inventions and think about the consequences of these. And then we're going to go into detail on some of them. The typewriter. Think about how that speeds up communication. Not to mention, makes it easier for historians like me to look at papers and understand what they're saying. The typewriter. The telephone, right? Yeah. You know, there's this great picture. Who invented the telephone? Alexander Graham Bell, right. And so you may have seen, you know, this picture of him, and he's got this old-fashioned earphone, and he has a smile on his face, and he took the first call. I think the smile may be because the first call was not a telemarketer. But in any case, we have the telephone. And think of how that speeds up communication. Business office to business office, I'm thinking in business terms. The communication potential with the telephone is tremendous. Being able to phone in trades on Wall Street, being able to talk with people and be able to coordinate ventures. Then one that you don't think of very much, the adding machine. How many would like to be an accountant in the days when you hand do numbers? Yeah, you got a big corporation, big ledgers of trades, and you hand do all those numbers? The slowness, the inaccuracies. The adding machine, it was invented by William Burroughs, who's a banker. He could calculate interest rates finally. You know, the adding machine was a tremendous invention, it was in the 1880s. All of this is 1865 to 1905. Let's see. I would like to mention the computer, invented by Herman Hollerith, a predecessor of IBM, invented in the 1890s. And the first big item that it did was the 1890 census. And Hollerith invented it right about 1890. He used the typewriter. He used the adding machine in order to collate census data on a card. It was a rectangular card that had holes punched in it to signify people when were you born, male or female, whatever, all of that on these cards. And then they would stick the cards in and could tabulate the material. It took the United States more than 10 years to finish the 1880 census. And then there were more people in 1890 than 1880, but it only took 2 years to complete the census in the 1890s because we had the first computer. Yeah, so we have the computer. Obviously, it got more refined when Herman Hollerith sold out to IBM in the 20th century. Let's see. I also want to mention the airplane. The airplane I want to mention because who invented the airplane? Wright brothers. You know, the person who many people, government officials, thought would invent the airplane is the person who had the subsidy to invent it, Samuel Langley. Samuel Langley, who had an inventor, he had honorary degrees from Harvard and Yale, from Oxford and Cambridge. He had flown the first flight. It was an unmanned flight. It was more kind of like a model airplane, which he flew over the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. And we thought, gosh, you can do a subsidy. We gave him a subsidy and thought, we've got the perfect guy to invent the airplane. Yeah, we paid for it, and his plane went like this. Whee, boom, right in the Potomac. Yeah. The Washington Post said a teenager could have skipped a stone farther than that airplane went. Yeah, it was incredible. And when he failed on his second one, the Washington Post said, maybe Mr. Langley should try his hand at submarines, not airplanes, as the plane goes into the water, not to return. The Wright brothers, with $2,000 of their own money, neither of them had been to college. Wilbur Wright had his teeth knocked out in a hockey accident, so he didn't speak much in public. They go down to Kitty Hawk and do a little exploring. They look at birds and all of this, correlate, and they finally, the first manned flight in 1903. So right at the tail end of this period of the late 1800s, sometimes called the Gilded Age, 1865, 1905, 40-year period. Now, just those inventions, if you look at them, I mean, the telephone, the typewriter, the adding machine, the computer, the airplane, is a pretty high amount to put on the table. But I have three that I want to spend more time on that I think are greater than those. I want to start with the greatest inventor of that period, or any period perhaps in the United States, who had over 1,000 patents for inventions. And who am I speaking of? Edison, Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison, right? The guy who said, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% what? Perspiration. And that's the key to entrepreneurship. I mean, it sounds like kind of a trite slogan, but Edison was optimistic. He'd always say, today I invented the 2,400th way not to invent a light bulb. Can you imagine that? And the next day it was 2,401. Such determination, such genius. Eventually, I think he made a difference in this room that we can see today. I want to say a few things about Edison. I want you to think about this because there's a concept that, well, you know, you can't really get into this class of entrepreneurs very easily. And look at his background. Edison was the seventh child in a family that wandered from Ohio to Michigan around the country. The father did odd jobs. I mean, he was a tavern owner. At other times, he was a tailor. He shingled roofs, that kind of thing. Thomas Edison was the seventh of 7 children. You think, well, he must have gotten something in his schooling. He went to school a grand total, according to Edison, and less than 1 month. Yeah, he's a kindergarten dropout. That's his total. His schooling is less than 1 month. And part of it is he was deaf in one ear, and he was half deaf in the other ear. And so obviously that's going to have an impact on his learning. And they said, the teacher said, quote, he's too stupid to learn. Edison's mother homeschooled him. And Edison's mother, I've got to have a quote here. Here's what Edison said about his mother. My mother was the making of me. She was so true, so sure of me, and I felt I had someone to live for, someone I must not disappoint. She gave me the courage to try. She gave me the courage to try. You look at these inventions that Edison has, and they are remarkable. Of course, obviously the light bulb and the discovery and uses of electricity. But what about the phonograph? The invention of the phonograph meant for the first time people could hear music without being in the presence of the orchestra. In my historical research, I've come across immigrants reading about who said, I heard Dvorak over in Europe, in Austria or whatever, and then I came over here, and 10 years I haven't heard really a concert. And all of a sudden, my children gave me a Dvorak album, and I can hear it again. Tears down their eyes. The idea that you could hear recorded music without it being performed right in front of you is something which is fabulously new to this generation in the late 1800s. And then you think about it, well, wait a minute, you're sitting there, yeah, that's good, Edison phonograph. I just said this guy was deaf in one ear and half deaf in the other. Would you who's going to invent the phonograph and say, oh yeah, it's probably some guy who's deaf in one ear, half deaf in the other, and went to school for less than a month? That is the inventor. And you wonder, how did he do it? He'd have sounds on these discs, and because he couldn't hear the sounds very well. By the way, Edison, again, optimistic. They'd say, gee, it's too bad you're deaf in one, or excuse me, it's too bad you're deaf in one ear and half deaf in the other. And he'd say, yeah, all the better not to hear you with. And I can be by myself and think about inventions and not be bothered. He looks at the bright side. So he's sitting there with this disc machine, and he can't tell whether it's working. Right? He says, now it should be playing, I don't hear anything. And sometimes it's reported he'd get down and literally put his teeth, there's no gum under here or anything. He'd put his teeth under there, put it right on the wood surface to see if he could hear the sound coming through there to know if it was playing or not. That's the man who invented that phonograph. I mean, it's so unbelievable. You could say, they need to make a movie about that. Edison would say, good, I invented the movie too. Yeah, he invented film. He's invented film, he's invented the phonograph. He's made an enormous contribution in the most unlikely of backgrounds. I tell you what, I've been college professor for decades. And when a student says, I just can't do it, these other people have better backgrounds than I do. We have to have a talk about Thomas Edison. We have to have a talk about Thomas Edison. And then we have that talk. And then sometimes he or she does better. They get it. I want to mention one other thing he did that may be more, in some ways, more of a daily kind of contribution you don't even think about. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, and Edison said, I wish I'd invented that. Can you imagine that? Well, I invented the phonograph, and I'm deaf. I wish I could have invented the telephone, too. But Graham Bell beat him to it. And he was kind of jealous. And I think there was a little bit of jealousy that went into this. Alexander Graham Bell, does anybody, when they would make contact with someone, what do we usually say? I mean, like, you pick up the phone. What do you say?
Hello.
Hello. That was not the original thing that Alexander Graham Bell invented for making initial contact. That was Edison's revision. Does anybody know what Bell had it?
Ahoy.
Correct. Say it again.
Ahoy.
Ahoy! Yeah, it was for a while, the contact word was ahoy! Ahoy! In fact, those of us who believe in original intent can continue to say ahoy. Yeah. When you have a question, greet me with ahoy. Yeah. I don't know, maybe that. How many, let me take a poll. How many like hello the way it is? Okay, quite a few. How many like ahoy? I don't have too many ahoys. Okay. Well, okay, Edison's right, I guess. Who knows? I'm one of them. I just kind of like the idea of ahoy! But anyway, I'm in the minority. Edison's right, as usual. Okay, Edison. And you may think, you're piling up entrepreneurs and inventors here in the late 1800s. Who else do you have? I have a second one, Henry Ford, who was a good friend of Edison. The automobile becomes a distinctly American invention, marketed effectively all over the world. And Henry Ford, although he didn't invent the automobile, was the one who marketed it very successfully. Ford was like to Edison, a guy who had a PhD, because although he had never went to high school, he graduated from middle school. So, I mean, he was way up there with his schooling. He'd actually been to middle school. And Ford's father died, or his mother died when he was about 12 years old. His father wanted him to work on a farm, and he was determined to go do something in the way of inventing and marketing. His mother said before she died, "Henry, you're a natural-born mechanic." And he was. He experimented while he was working for Edison's electric company. He was experimenting at night on making what he called a quadricycle. And his wheels were bicycle wheels. In the 1890s, he launched his first quadricycle, and it caught on. Now, you might say, well, you know, this is inevitable that technology is going to come and the car will replace the carriage. But one of the points I want to make here is Henry Ford speculated that if he could get the car of a high enough quality and a low enough price that he could replace the carriage. Because when he asked people what they wanted, they didn't say a horseless carriage or a quadricycle or a car or whatever. They said, I want faster horses and carriages with better shock absorbers. That's what they wanted. He knew people would want a car before they knew they wanted a car. I love those kinds of entrepreneurs, and here's another one. Steve Jobs knew I wanted this before I knew I wanted it. You know, your music and all this information on a phone. Steve Jobs invested billions of dollars before one was ever sold under the assumption. Look at the courage. The courage to invest, the courage, the perseverance, the 99% perspiration that goes with the 1% genius in order to make a successful product. This is similar in a way to the automobile, because the automobile was something that Ford went forward with that he didn't know, had no idea. It was a shot in the dark. And he got the prices down. He did the Model T, as many of you know, the assembly line, where people would put different parts on, because you could make more that way. You could make them quicker and more efficiently. He found out, of course, that people got bored. Hard to believe, isn't it? You're screwing nuts and bolts in on a wheel, and they get tired of doing that day after day. And so we had lots of absenteeism, and when you have absenteeism on an assembly line, that is very damaging for production. And so that's when Ford said, I need to price my labor in such a way that they're going to come and do that. And maybe I can rotate jobs around a little bit and do some things to help. He thought, also, I noticed that people are less efficient, because people back in the late 1800s were working 10 and sometimes 12-hour days. Ford said, the inefficiency after 8 hours is such that I think we're just going to cut the work day to 8 hours. And I think we're going to give roughly double the industrial wage. The industrial wage was about $2.70 a day. Of course, that purchases more than $2.70 does today, but a lot more, about more than 20 times more. But the idea was we're going to increase the wage, and he decided on the $5 day, which is almost double the $2.70. So, $5 day, and he said, I'm hiring people for only an 8-hour day, and I'm paying you almost double, so I mean, you can't make more than that if you work a 10 or a 12-hour day. And you'll only work 8 hours, and you'll end up with more money. And he discovered there in Michigan that he had lines that were going out the door to apply to work at his company. He would tell people who would come in, I like you, I think you're going to be a good worker, I'm going to hire you. Or at least I'm going to offer to hire you. Should you not show up for work, you are out, and one of those people, you see them all out there? One of those people will have your job. But you show yourself diligent and you come to work and do your job, you're going to make record wages and you're not going to work as hard as you used to. And he had finally a stable workforce, and they were so productive that Henry Ford made the statement as the cost of the car was going down, down, down. It went from thousands down, it's getting down to $500 a car, $400 a car. And he ended up saying the $5 day was the best cost-cutting move I ever made. He was so far ahead of the curve. Nobody else was working on that kind of idea. Ford was genius. For example, let me give one final example here. He was very eccentric, by the way. He comes around, he says, carrots are the perfect food. Isn't that interesting? He says, I never eat sugar. And people would say, that's probably good. Why not? And he said, because sugar is crystals, and I'm afraid if I swallow them, they'll get in my stomach and cut my lining up. Yeah. He wouldn't eat chickens because chickens ate bugs. Yeah. He wanted to promote alternative fuels. He never was able to make ethanol profitable. Gasoline was the fuel that was the most economical. But he kept thinking that ethanol eventually, fuel from corn and that sort of thing would win the race. And so he wore around suits made out of soybeans. Soybean suits. He and Edison were buddies. And they'd go together. Whenever Henry Ford liked someone, he'd slip up behind them and kick them in the rear. And one time he and Edison were at a posh hotel. Imagine this. You're there with your kids and you're saying, there's Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. They're together. Watch them. They're great men. And one time, at one point, standing there, Ford sneaked up behind Edison and kicked him in the rear. And Edison turned around and kicked him. And they fought and they broke a chandelier. So I don't think all the kids were that impressed. But, I'm trying to say these are eccentric people, but they're not people you would expect to be geniuses, except they had good ideas and they persevered. Ford was enormously popular, and his Model T held over half the market into the 1920s. And he ceased to be innovative because the General Motors came up with the clutch with better, gas gauges, and they came up with power, ultimately with automatic start rather than crank start. And so they started making more popular cars, and eventually they swooped Ford. But for a long time, he was dominating the market. Now, I want to do one more, and that is John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller's father was a quack medicine salesman. he took John D. Rockefeller was the oil guy who made American oil more competitive than anywhere else in the world. America's domination of the oil industry, a lot of which is in the United States, but there's oil in a lot of other places too. Other countries simply could not compete with Rockefeller. He was efficient. He integrated his companies by making barrels and marketing his product. He made money from the byproducts of kerosene. See, a lot of people just they changed the kerosene into gasoline or into the sludge that you get in oil. They would take the kerosene for lighting candles or lighting lamps for illumination, and then they would throw the rest away. But Rockefeller, he was a great, strong Christian, and he said, God made that for a purpose. We just need to find out what the purpose is. And so he would have his scientists. He was an original research R&D, which we take for granted. That was Rockefeller. You get these people working on byproducts, and then they would find, you can make wax, you can do naphtha, you can do paving materials, all this sort of thing with the byproducts. And then when the other people would throw their sludge away, he'd have people go get it, bring it in, and we'll make profits from it. He had the most competitive oil industry. His company, Standard Oil, produced 90% of the American oil market. Oil in the market, and over 50% of the oil that was sold in the world. Imagine the jobs, the immigrants, everything that comes with the prosperity of having the greatest oil industry in the country. Also think how that helped Henry Ford. All of these comes together. The American century is certainly the 20th century, and it's those contributions that come in from the late 1800s are what make that so effective. Now, I've given you these entrepreneurs. So you've got this transformative oil industry, but you've got Edison, you have Ford with the automobile, and then you have the others that I mentioned, and you have that, at least what I'm hypothesizing is the greatest creative spirit, and it's here in the United States, and it launches the United States into world economic leadership, and everybody in this country is benefiting from when those entrepreneurs contributed to this country. I just want to conclude by comparing them a little bit with entrepreneurs from today. And let me get my sheet here. Yeah. I'm thinking, I was thinking, the big ones today, who do you think I ought to have on that list? Who? Musk. Yeah, he's there. Jeff Bezos, Amazon. Zuckerberg and Facebook. I put Warren Buffett, of course, Steve Jobs with Apple. These are great inventions by products that are being produced by this generation. Larry Ellison at Oracle and Bill Gates at Microsoft. And I thought, one thing that's interesting about looking at those people, and I don't know how far to push some of this, but I have to say this, schooling was not greatly important to this generation either. Learning is tremendously important. Schooling less so, and I'm a little bit embarrassed about this as a lifelong college professor, but it suggests to me that we need perhaps to have information that's a little bit more pertinent in our classes. But I think beyond that, a lot of these entrepreneurs are simply people who they get caught up in entrepreneurship and they don't want to sit in school, right? Because it's a distraction from being out there inventing something. Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates went to Harvard, but they both dropped out. Larry Ellison dropped out of the University of Illinois, then he went to the University of Chicago and dropped out again. Steve Jobs dropped out from Reed College in Oregon. His father was a high school dropout. In school, Steve was reported by his teachers to, quote, be not functioning in the classroom. Yeah. Warren Buffett did not want to go to college, but his father made him. He's from Nebraska, and he went to the University of Nebraska, but his father made him do it. Elon Musk is an exception. He did graduate from the University of Pennsylvania, but then he went on to graduate school in Stanford and dropped out. He had to do that to be one of the boys, you know. The one exception here is Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Princeton, and he was a National Merit Scholar. So there's one who was quite talented, at least on the academic side. But it's just a side note, he was born to teenagers, unmarried teenagers. The father was an alcoholic. I also like he's an alcoholic, but he rode unicycles. That would be one of the last things I would want to do if I were an alcoholic, right? Riding unicycles. Maybe that's part of what destroyed the marriage. I don't know, but they got divorced. And the mother married a Cuban immigrant named Miguel Bezos. And so that's where Jeff gets his last name. None of these people came from wealthy families, just like the entrepreneurs of the late 1800s. The family was often dysfunctional, as was Rockefeller's family. His father ended up leaving the family and became a bigamist and just disappeared from John D's life. Yet, and all studies show that that's terrible for prediction for success. People who don't graduate from college are, on the balance, not as successful as those who do, and people who come from dysfunctional families, on balance, are not as successful as those who do. But you can have problems in that area, and if you have ideas, and you are convinced that those ideas work, and you have the courage to persist and put your 1% genius and apply 99% perspiration, according to Edison, that is the recipe for success. We have a good recent generation, which I've just talked about here a little bit, and we had a fantastic generation in the late 1800s, which, it's argumentative, I'm sure I'll have somebody disagree, was the greatest generation of entrepreneurs and successful inventions and the marketing of those inventions here in the United States of any generation in human history. What I've tried to do is outline what made the United States successful, some characteristics of the entrepreneurs who accomplished the task, and compare them a little bit with the present. And hey, I think there are insights out there that you people are likely to have that I may have overlooked, and I want to open the field to questions. Yeah, let's have some questions. Yeah, Steve?
So if you have a question, up here at the microphone.
Okay, yeah, up at the microphone. Well, I'd like to.
So I'll draw the first one.
Okay, go ahead, Steve.
So in your book, The Myth of the Robber Baron,
Yes.
you talk about true entrepreneurs and political entrepreneurs. Can you give us a little insight?
Right. I describe in The Myth of the Robber Barons, which is going into its 9th edition. It's had success because ideas when I was studying these people came in, and I thought some of these entrepreneurs of the late 1800s had huge success, and then everybody who had a government subsidy flopped. And that's the key. I call those who rely on government subsidies for success, I call political entrepreneurs. Those who rely on producing a competitive product at a good price, I call market entrepreneurs, a distinction. And then I compare the two, and they're often operating in the same industries. For example, in steamships, the United States government gave a subsidy to Edward Collins to do steamship traffic back to and from New York to Liverpool, England, back and forth, and carry passengers and freight. And he kept asking for an increase in subsidy every year. And finally, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was also in that business, said, "Hey, Congress, whatever you're going to offer him this year, I'll do it for half price." That's interesting, isn't it? And Congress, you'd think, well, yeah, get it at half price. And they said no. we're going to keep giving it to Collins. And so Vanderbilt got mad and said, I'm going to go in, I'm going to compete with the subsidized Collins, and I'm going to do it for no subsidy. And finally, he outcompeted. He dropped the prices. He made successful trips. And Collins, in an effort to try to beat him and upstage him, had these wrecks. And had, the Titanic is not the first one. One of Collins' ships whacked into an iceberg, everybody drowned. He had one ship that took off and never arrived. And he kept saying, it's going to come one of these days. And then he got money from Congress to build more ships at government expense. And I thought, this is so remarkable. That's the first chapter of the story. But then the second one is on the transcontinental railroads, where we had the Union Pacific Railroad. And Abraham Lincoln said, I want to build this Union Pacific Railroad. I want it to go from Omaha, Nebraska, all the way across to California. And I want to do it. And he even told the people who built it, if you need more money, ask for double and you shall have it. Is that something good to say to subsidized people? Yeah. Here are you? This is something. Brace yourself. Everybody brace yourself. They asked for double, they got it, and they flopped. Yeah. And I thought that was fantastic, at least to write on and describe. Well, one thing, they were being paid by the mile. So here's the Union Pacific. It's looking like this. They're paid by the mile. Is that a good way to build a railroad? James J. Hill, a Canadian immigrant who only had one eye, a disabled Canadian immigrant came in and said, gee, I think I'll build a railroad with no federal expense, and I'll do it like this. And he's the one who built what's arguably the greatest railroad of the era, the Great Northern Railroad. Today it's the Burlington Northern, with no subsidy. I thought that's so fantastic. I had a PhD in economic history and nobody ever told me that story. And I don't think it was because they thought, don't tell Folsom or he'll go around to University of Louisville and everywhere else and tell people. I don't think they knew it. See, it's interesting how you have a memory hole and failures just drop in it, and we don't have them to bring before us to determine what kind of public policy should we have on issues of invention and entrepreneurship and building companies. I mentioned the airplane where Samuel Langley got a subsidy and his airplanes flopped, and the Wright brothers build successful airplanes. So I guess what I'm saying is that political entrepreneurs fail, market entrepreneurs succeed. And I see some other questions. Go for it.
All right, thanks very much for coming. Sticking with the topic
Yes.
of market and political entrepreneurs, I want you to categorize Elon Musk.
10 years ago, I wrote a book called Uncle Sam Can't Count. It's published by HarperCollins and Good. And I evaluated Elon Musk, and I said he's a mixture because he's taking government money. And I wasn't very positive on him. And I'm much more positive on his entrepreneurship today. I'm trying to recall all the copies because I actually have a high opinion of it. Because if you look at, it's true that there's some subsidies involved. The problem is we're in an era where the federal government has gotten so big that it's almost impossible to be a pure market entrepreneur the way it was possible to be 100 years ago. Musk manages sometimes with SpaceX and whatever to get some subsidies, but he manages to keep the entrepreneurial spirit, and I've got to credit him with that. But his rockets go and they land right. Well, we don't want to waste our rockets. Let's figure out how to make them land so they don't disappear and have a collision. A very thoughtful man, and I also have to admit, the entrepreneurs I've given you, Bezos, Amazon, Zuckerberg, Facebook, Larry Ellison at Oracle, and go back, Henry Ford, automobile, right? John D. Rockefeller Oil. They're one-trick ponies. They're the greatest, but they're in one area. And what can I say about the guy who gave us PayPal and then SpaceX and Tesla. And he's managed to be extremely successful in a variety of areas. I still think can't categorize him as a pure market entrepreneur, but he has managed to be different from the others who've been involved with the federal government. He's been very, very successful. What do you think? What do you think about him?
I asked you because I can't decide for myself. Whether he's a crony or whether he's the greatest entrepreneur of all time.
He has the potential, I think, to be the greatest entrepreneur of all time. Right now, in dollars that are 1970s dollars, John D. Rockefeller still, on some estimates, he was the first billionaire in U.S. history, and Henry Ford was the second. Their money is still, but that's getting close now. And Musk, at least when Tesla was selling at 435, he was ahead of him. Now it's dropped down to 299 today. So now Rockefeller's back ahead. But still, they're the greatest, they're the most effective capitalists of their generations. Yeah. Well, yeah, go ahead. You have a question?
Yeah, so can you hear me? Perfect. So at what point do we take like a second look at these controversial and sometimes awful industry giants, even though they're like the power behind the American economy, if that makes any sense?
Yeah. You know, Steve Goman, who is director here of the center, he said that when he was young and a kid, he used to think, I want to study economics, but I don't want to study business people because they're corrupt. And there's sort of an image of that. And this isn't to say there aren't a bunch who are, but I found the ones who are corrupt are the ones taking the federal subsidies. They're the ones most likely to have problems and then to try to manipulate the law and manipulate the subsidy to overcome their problem. Once you are focused on producing a great, think of Henry Ford. I'm going to produce a car. See, I've got problems in the workforce. I want to give these people higher wages, and I'm going to try to hope that they're so efficient that I can produce a car more efficiently than anybody else in the world. Nobody else had their mind. See, they go where other people don't. He went there and he produced this incredibly competitive product that absolutely transformed American culture. And yeah, you have to give a great deal of credit for that. Yeah, thank you.
I kind of have a follow-up, if you don't mind.
Oh, follow it. Go ahead.
So I agree with you. I'm not gonna say that, but
Do you think the
correct me if
current generation is better than the old?
What I was gonna say is, wasn't Ford like a known Nazi sympathizer?
In later life, see, again, what we're talking about here is their impact on the market. That's why I kind of said, right, is somebody who has a soybean suit totally stable, right? Is somebody who won't eat chickens because they eat bugs, is that somebody who you think, boy, this guy, I admit he got off on that, he did. And he did sympathize for a while with the Nazis. And so, yeah, he was anti-Jewish. One of the reasons was when he was trying to get money to fund his enterprise, Ford Motor Company, he couldn't get funding from a lot of the bankers in the Detroit area and elsewhere. And a lot of those bankers were Jewish, and he got it in his head that the Jews were out to get him. And, you know, it's like carrots are the perfect food, right? And sugar crystals I won't eat because I'll cut my stomach. And these Jews are bad people. But in an economy, what matters is, can you produce a good product at a competitive price? Yes, he's a nut. But I admire him. He produced a good product that it transformed American culture and has made my life easier. So yeah, I don't agree with some of the things he says and does, and I think that's fine, but you know, I look at the impact on the market. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I just want to, over here.
Oh, I see you.
I just want to say I read your book through the reading group and I really enjoyed it.
Well, good, thank you. Listen, that's not going to go unrewarded. Please come up and take this pamphlet that I wrote. He liked it. Good, now you can ask your question. And if it's a real nasty one, I want you to give the pamphlet back.
So my question is, you made a really good case against subsidies in the book, But I was wondering, do you think there ever is a case where subsidies can be used and helpful for the market?
That's a good question. And the thing is, it's awkward. I'm not saying it couldn't happen because look at Elon Musk a little bit. Although he could have done this, I think, without the subsidies. But then you're getting into what we call counterfactual history because it didn't play out that way. I think it is less likely for a company to succeed with a subsidy because you rely on the subsidy and you rely on the government to keep giving it to you instead of relying on producing a good product at a competitive price. And so what I think in public policy is the given assumption ought to be it probably is not a good idea to give a federal subsidy to industries to develop and let the market take its place and let the people keep their money and then they can use it to buy these good products instead of sending it to the government. Now, I may be wrong. I may be wrong, but I want to say this. Do you think that the discussion of that, which is one of the biggest today, how active should the government be? That's what DOGE is all about. That these people are in areas that they shouldn't be in and we need to close them down. That's at least one view. It's Elon Musk's view. But, and then some are saying, no, we need some of these people, and it's an interesting debate. Should that debate take place in an environment where we don't know anything about the failed airplane subsidies, the failed railroad subsidies, the failed steamship subsidies? And by the way, when I did the Roosevelt book, we've got a whole list that's even greater than that comes in that Roosevelt was doing. Do you think that it's better for public policy to know that and then have the discussion, or to go in without knowing the history of failure of these subsidies? To ask the question is almost to answer it, isn't it? Of course we should know that. And so my question to you, aside from my friend who read my book, how many of you knew that we had I'll put it this way, we had 4 transcontinental railroads, 3 had subsidies, 1 didn't, 3 failed and one didn't, and the one that succeeded had no federal subsidy. We have 2 steamship companies, one was loaded with government subsidies, one had no government subsidies, the one with no government subsidies was successful. The airplane, we had Samuel Langley getting the subsidy to invent it, he did not invent it. 2 bicycle mechanics, one with broken teeth in his mouth from a hockey accident, invented it in their spare, they were bicycle mechanics, they invented it in their spare time in North Carolina. I think that it's useful to have that information as we enter into discussions on what to do with these people coming into Washington with their hands out saying, give me some subsidy and I'll do good things. Because all of those people who got the subsidies that I've mentioned did exactly that. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You get to keep the pamphlet. Yes, sir.
My original question kind of got answered there about subsidies and if you still think they're appropriate. But I think that also blends into an important question, which is, do you think the government's tune on subsidies has changed, or do you think we're going to see them continue to be a relevant part of industry and relevant part of the government's policy towards new industries?
Wow, good question. One thing, when you ask, I'm an economic historian. When you ask a historian about the past, we go, ooh, 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 ooh. When you ask us about the future, we go, You don't know for sure, and I want to say that, you don't know for sure. I would like to think it's going to be greatly reduced. I do think this, the more information we have about the track record of those industries that have received subsidies and those industries that have not, the better public policy decisions we will be making, and my hope is that we move in that direction. I can't promise it, but I hope it. Here, I want to give you a pamphlet too.
Thank you.
Come on down, please. This is a pamphlet called 3 Reasons to be Proud of America. I wrote it a year ago, and I look at 3 areas where United States contributions are indispensable Oh, you're Hagen.
Yes. I was going to say no to a second.
Yeah, Hagen, I think I already gave you one.
Yes, you did.
Okay.
You want this one back?
Yes, I want that one back.
Over there. I
Pardon?
was going to give it to my friend over there, actually.
Give it to your friend. Thank you, Hagen. I'm sorry I didn't recognize you up there, but I see you now. Yeah. Hagen I like talking with Hagen. Listen, when you're an old timer and you're up here and some kid comes in there and starts talking about the 1970s and politics with Jimmy Carter and Richard Nixon, and he's talking knowledgeably, it's like, wow, they get it. They get what I was going through. They get it. I appreciate it, Hagen. Do we have another question? Yes.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
So there's a current wave of, I guess I'd call it anti-monopolist behavior going on in politics, and it's fairly bipartisan, which is the interesting point about it.
Yeah.
Lena Khan's not the FTC chair anymore, but Trump's FTC chair just upheld the same policy on mergers and acquisitions in the past couple of weeks, saying they're not going to change it. Do you see this level of anti-monopolist behavior as a potential positive to consumers, or do you think it's another government distortion the way you're talking about, like with subsidies?
It could go either way. And, I'm influenced by the people I study, right? What do you do with a deaf person who invents the photograph who says, no, I kind of like being deaf. I don't have to hear the phone ring, right? I like the optimism. And I think it's good to be upbeat because there's a lot of reason to believe that our country has a lot of future in ahead of it that's good future. So I think that there's a good chance that we can see the anti-monopolists work in such a way that we don't get bureaucracy. See, Doge, interestingly enough, when they started, they said, we will expire in a year and a half. Right? In other words, they knew if we're a government agency, we will get in and then we will have a bureaucracy, and pretty soon we will be worse than the people we're trying to eliminate. They saw that. See, that's learning from history. And so I'm hoping that we have success. Here, let me give you a pamphlet too. That's a good question.
I'll take a pamphlet.
Yeah. Yeah. Here you go. See what you think. Yeah. Another question.
Hi. Thank you for coming today.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. I went to Center College and I taught at Murray State. My wife is born in Kentucky. She's from Mayfield. My son's born in Kentucky. And, I feel like I'm coming home when I come up here. Go ahead, have a question.
Okay, so would you support policies like progressive taxation or antitrust enforcement today to prevent the kind of economic power that the so-called robber barons had or were accused of having?
I'm glad you asked that question because it injects assumptions into it, doesn't it? We need progressive taxation, right? Because the rich are doing things that may not be so good. And we need antitrust because they get big, right? And then they manipulate and stuff when they're big. And that's why I thought it was interesting, because I explored both of these because I think that's such a good question. In fact, that's pamphlet worthy. Those are pamphlet worthy questions. I ended up concluding that the framework of that is not really very good because you sit there, well, they get big and they get manipulated and then we eliminate them. The assumption, isn't the assumption there that we have efficient government and that they make efficient decisions and they eliminate people who are dangerous? The first company to be eliminated and shot down in an antitrust law was James J. Hill's Great Northern Railroad. Why? Because the other railroads who had subsidies were being beaten by him, and under an antitrust law they could say, you're too big, we want to cut you down, and use government to do it. That kind of gives a different perspective on it. The second one was John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. He said, anybody who has a market share that's upwards of 88% has the potential to restrain trade. And so we knock out Rockefeller's company and force it to divest into 30 different pieces. And then nobody has enough money in oil, none of those pieces, to go in and invest in the Middle East when oil's discovered shortly thereafter, and do 99-year leases in Kuwait and things like that that could have delivered cheap oil to us for the next century. It's just something to think about. As for progressive taxation, the income tax came in 1913, and it was 7%. And that's only on people who earned the equivalent today of $20 million or more. If you earned up to $20 million, you had to pay 7%. That's a marginal rate, too. And then if you earned over about, in today, 100,000, you didn't have to pay any. So there you have the first tax.
So you don't support it?
Well, 8 years later, it was moved up to 15%.
Yeah.
In the 1920s, it was moved up to 25% top rate. Under President Hoover in 1932, it went up to 63% top rate. Franklin Roosevelt got it up to 79%. Then he got it up to 94% on all income over $100,000. And then he had a 100% tax rate on all income over $25,000. Congress overturned that executive order. And Congress the next year passed a bill, debated a bill, fortunately it didn't get passed, that would have a 100.6% tax, not marginal, 100.6 on millionaires. I was so stunned when I saw that because I'd never seen it talked about. And my book, FDR Goes to War, is the first book that I know of that talks in detail, because I'm quoting congressmen. Someone got up there and said, if a person has to pay $1,006,000 on an income of $1 million, how does he pay for room, his house? How does he pay for anything? How does he pay his other taxes? And on the Senate floor and on the House floor, we had people who said, listen, people who are making a million have stuff already, and then we take the million and they live on their other stuff. How many have an incentive to produce stuff if your tax rate is 100%? Yeah. Boy, anybody who raises your hand, you don't get a pamphlet. However, you get a pamphlet. Would you come up and take my pamphlet, please? For asking two excellent questions. I hope you see why I'm not enthusiastic about either the antitrust or the progressive income tax. But think about it. All I ask is you think about it, because I asked those questions when I was your age, and I never could get a good answer, and I kind of wandered away thinking they were valid. And it wasn't until I got into the research that I said, wait a minute, I don't think I agree with that anymore. And so I'm glad to at least speak out and give other people at least a chance to think about other ideas. Thank you. Yes.
So I want to go back to Henry Ford. You said that he raised his minimum wage kind of like out of the goodness of his heart.
Well, is it out of the goodness of his heart exactly, or was it financial?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to address that.
Oh, go ahead. Comment then.
His invention of the assembly line made it highly dangerous and repetitive for his workers to do work, so a lot of them were leaving. And the proliferation of the car has kind of led to what you could probably call a lot of adverse effects in our society. So my question is, why do you see the successful products as an inherent good?
Yeah, that's good. You know, the economists like to say there's some bad externalities around here. You know, I like that. You know, in economics we like to use fancy language to I agree. The car is not an unmixed blessing, is it? It has some pollutant. We have accidents, right? There you have to measure. I mean, it takes some, I think, sophistication and some a certain amount of perspective. You know, I'm going to try to see how things work to say, are we better off with having an automobile which has positives, and then you list those, but there are negatives here? Is that an advantage? And if so, if not, maybe we should do something, but if so, we have to accept that as risk that comes with living, right? I mean, I'm about ready to eat pizza tonight. What happens if it's so high cal and it has all these oils that Robert Kennedy tells me are bad for me, and I eat them and I die on the way home, you know? That's a negative externality of coming here to speak, but I still think it's worth the risk. And I am going to have pizza anyway. You know what I mean? Or something. The point being, I'm willing to accept risks, and I think the car, the value that it provides, offsets the risks, but we should be aware that it's not an unmixed blessing. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm going to ask one last question here.
Okay.
You claim that the Gilded Age was the best time, and I think it was because it was low-hanging fruit. Am I right?
Okay,
and so
elaborate.
There wasn't anything there, and so now we invent stuff. I mean, there was stuff there, but you know, they got new technology. So until we might get to a point with AI that things might act. Do you think we could get to a point where it might be better? You know, you can do this thing, but
AI is a tough one to work through. That's such a good question, Steve. I'm giving you a pamphlet too. I'll give it to you at dinner. Thank you. Is that any other questions, or do you have anything else?
If not, let's thank Burt for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.